The evidence is very clear. The underlying logic of the U.S.-style free trade agreement is harmful to workers. It's harmful to agricultural workers. It's harmful not only to the U.S., but particularly to many of our partners that we engage in trade with. It's not that trade itself is bad, and it's not that engagement is bad, but the underlying logic of a neoliberal trade agreement is harmful to workers around the world. So we're going to go into more detail on that this morning with our excellent panel of speakers. I first just wanted to call your attention to this latest issue of the New Labor Forum, featuring an article on the Trans-Pacific Partnership by one of our speakers this morning, Arthur Stamoulis. So we encourage you to subscribe. And I'm going to introduce our three speakers that we have here this morning. First, Arthur Stamoulis is Executive Director of Citizens Trade Campaign, a national coalition of labor, environmental, consumer, and human rights organizations working to stop the expansion of NAFTA-style trade agreements and promote a positive vision for international trade. Started in 1992 in response to the passage of NAFTA, it now has over 12 million members and comprises 20 national organizations and 12 state affiliate coalitions. Arthur speaks and writes frequently on issues of global trade and is the author of an excellent article on our subject today called Trading Away the Future, an analysis of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I just mentioned here from New Labor Forum. Okay, Celeste Drake is our second speaker. Celeste is the Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist at the AFL-CIO, where she actively monitors negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement and the US-EU Free Trade Agreement. She advocates for policies to ensure shared gains from global trade. She also covers issues related to the World Trade Organization, global economic development, manufacturing, and foreign investment policy, serves as the AFL-CIO's primary advocate for the labor rights cases under the Generalized System of Preferences and various free trade agreements. She has testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and various House subcommittees, the International Trade Commission, and the Trade Policy Staff Committee. We are also pleased to welcome Kian Frederick, who has recently been named to head up the new Citizens Trade Campaign office in New York City. Kian began a career as a union organizer 20 years ago when she led a strike of her Unite Here Local 100 coworkers and won. She later became the first rank and file member and first woman in her local to be elected to executive office. She has worked on organizing and issue campaigns with Unite Here, AFT, CWA, SEIU, and the National AFL-CIO, and other union locals and community groups in New York and Miami. So we're going to start out this morning with Arthur's going to be speaking to you to give an overview of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, how it came to be, what corporations want from it, and the basic campaign strategy labor and community groups are using to address it. Celeste will focus in on the partnership's specific threats to labor and working families, and also give some background on what labor has done to push for a trade policy they could support. And then finally, Kian will speak briefly about the New York congressional delegation and local opportunities to join the campaign. And it's wonderful to see you all. This is such a hugely important issue. I've been working in Asia for the last several years where people have been panicked and talking about this agreement since, for maybe 3 or 4 years. So it's really crucial that we really get the word out as much as we can here in the United States. We're a little behind the game.
TPP está siendo negociado a puertas cerradas.
TPP could be more corporate influence over my government's economic policy.
TPP could mean that I feel less secure.
TPP could mean that global corporations pit worker against worker in a race to the bottom.
TPP nos haría más difícil organizar a los trabajadores.
TPP could mean fewer work opportunities for local residents.
El TPP significaría menos dinero para cubrir las necesidades de mi familia.
TPP significaría tener medicamentos en las casas.
TPP could mean companies write my country's food labels and safety standards.
TPP significaría comida nociva y contaminación ambiental.
TPP is a trade and globalization agreement between 12 countries. And even after negotiations are finished, more countries can join.
TPP could make it harder to organize workers.
TPP could mean deforestation.
TPP could mean more overfishing.
Le TPP pourrait vouloir dire que notre voix ne sera plus écoutée.
Este acuerdo transpacífico es una gran prueba para las posibilidades futuras de la población mundial.
TPP could mean we lose our voice.
Workers' rights, environmental protection, access to medicines. We urge you to ensure that the agreement will be balanced and centred on people's needs, not simply the needs of corporations.
TPP is going to happen.
TPP va a pasar.
TPP is going to happen unless you do something about it.
TPP será una realidad si no hacemos algo.
Great. I love that video by the AFL-CIO. So thank you, everyone, for being here this morning, for the opportunity to speak with you. Thanks especially to Karen, Eloisa, Stephanie, and everyone at the Murphy Institute who made today's event possible. Again, my name is Arthur Stamoulis. I direct Citizens Trade Campaign, which is a national trade coalition. I've been tasked with providing the big picture overview of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and hopefully in doing that, I will leave you with the impression that the TPP is a big deal for the labor movement and for other progressive movements in New York and throughout the world. You know, I think one of the first things I want to just say is that when we come together across movements, labor and environmental groups and family farm organizations, consumer, student, human rights, other progressive organizations, we have a lot of power. And we actually have a long and remarkable history when it comes to trade of beating back corporate power grabs described as trade agreements. So let's see if I'm doing this. All right. So personally, I got involved in trade justice organizing during the 1999 battle in Seattle, where the movement of movements came together and derailed the millennial round of WTO negotiations. Others of you may have participated in the successful campaigns against the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, any of a host of other trade deals that have been beaten back. You know, when we work together, we have beaten back some of the most powerful and well-organized economic interests in human history. And I just wanted to, you know, normally I end my presentations at that point, but I want to start with it today, just so that we all really remember that history, internalize it a little bit, and understand, number one, that we can win on the TPP. And the second reason why I start with it is because it really helps explain the context for the TPP. Because what the TPP is it's an end run around the People's Movement victory at the WTO. For well over a decade now, corporations have been trying to use the World Trade Organization to expand their agenda of more privatization, more deregulation, more liberalization. And ever since '99, thanks in no small part to a lot of great organizing, countries within the WTO have been standing up and saying no. And whereas the WTO ostensibly works by consensus, this has been enough to keep the WTO at an impasse, at a stalemate for, you know, again, well over a decade now. So corporations view the TPP as their way around that stalemate. The TPP allows them to work through their proxy, the US government, to essentially cherry pick the countries that it thinks are most likely to play ball with their agenda, to set the rules of the game governing the global economy among that handful of nations, knowing full well that the impacts that it will have will extend well beyond just those countries directly involved. And, you know, if you look at just those countries directly involved, it's nothing to sneeze at. Just the countries currently at the table in the TPP talks, there are Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, the US, and Vietnam. Just those 12 countries together represent approximately 40% of the global economy. So just in and of itself, this would be a huge agreement. But the TPP is also explicitly being negotiated as what's called a docking agreement. meaning that other countries will be pressured to dock on or to join over time. Any APEC nation is already able to, petition the existing TPP countries and ask to be included, and the U.S. Trade Representative has repeatedly said that any country that's willing to, meet the quote-unquote high standards set for the agreement is welcome to join. And already, the Philippines, Thailand, Taiwan, South Korea, Colombia, Costa Rica, even China have talked about joining. So if the TPP were to be enacted, you'd best believe that it's going to get a lot bigger than even the 40% of the global economy it would already cover. Some people have taken to calling the TPP NAFTA on steroids, and I get why we do that. Some people still remember what NAFTA is and know what it means, and that that agreement has been branded in the public imagination much better than any other trade agreement. But for those who've been doing this for a while and have worked on these issues, what the TPP really is China PNTR on steroids, the FTAA on steroids. This is far, far bigger than NAFTA. This is far, far bigger than any trade agreement we've had to deal with in a long time. And the impacts it would have on working families were it to be enacted is magnitude larger than any trade agreement we've experienced in quite a while. Unless there's any misunderstanding, this is absolutely being negotiated by and for big corporations. After 19 major rounds of negotiations over a period of nearly 4 years now, the Obama administration still refuses to tell the public what it's been proposing for the TPP in our names, and it's required that other countries not release any information to their citizens either, which is a rollback in transparency, by the way, from even the Bush years. The Bush administration published draft text for the Free Trade Area of the Americas. Proposals for the WTO are routinely published online. The TPP is deliberately being kept secret from the public. And while it's being kept secret from the public, meanwhile, the Obama administration has chosen to grant approximately 600 corporate lobbyists representing Walmart, Cargill, Chevron, and lots more, special cleared advisor status that gives them access to the texts. And so if they're not literally writing the U.S. proposals for the TPP, and really there's no reason to suspect that they aren't literally writing the U.S. proposals for the TPP, but if they're not, they're at least looking over negotiators' shoulders and saying, nah, don't do that, try this instead. It's true that some union officials and a small handful of others are also cleared advisors and have access to some of the texts, but they're vastly outnumbered by the corporate interests, and more importantly, they're forbidden from sharing what they learn with their own members or with anybody else. So what we know about the TPP comes not from our own government, but from a handful of leaked documents first published on our website, and frankly, from one-on-one conversations with negotiators from other countries. So the process behind the TPP, to my mind, is completely corrupt. But let's talk about what this pact would mean in practice. And I think we're going to...
What is your website?
It's citizenstrade.org. All right. So what's the first thing I want to say about the content of this? I guess one of the things to say is that various countries within the TPP are being promoted as low-cost labor alternatives to China, especially Vietnam, where the average minimum wage is a third of what it is in China's manufacturing centers. So the TPP is very much a pact for companies that feel that Chinese workers are overpaid. They don't just think that your members are overpaid, they think that Chinese workers are overpaid. And there's no question that if this moved forward, it would negatively affect ongoing organizing efforts in China. And of course, if it's negatively affecting ongoing organizing efforts in China, it's going to negatively affect ongoing organizing efforts in Mexico and in Central America and throughout the world, including, of course, the United States. And Celeste is going to cover the TPP's potential impacts on working Americans in a lot of detail. But since we're at the Labor Forum, I do want to make just a few broad points on this. First, as I said before, this isn't NAFTA on steroids. it's China PNTR on steroids. The AFL-CIO's Executive Council released a statement earlier this year, saying this could cause millions of American job losses if it continues forward on its current course, and that's not hyperbole. The TPP would cost millions of American jobs. The Korea Free Trade Agreement, much, much, much smaller, in just its first year is estimated to have cost 40,000 American jobs. This is, again, magnitudes bigger, and will spell millions of job losses for American workers. The second point is that we'll certainly see an increase in the offshoring of manufacturing jobs under this pact, but it's not just manufacturing jobs. Vietnam, for instance, is already a go-to source for computer programming for companies that think that China and India are a little too costly. So there's all sorts of service sector jobs that would be offshored if the TPP were to move forward. Third, as bad as this would be for the millions of workers and their families who would be directly experiencing that trade-related job loss, it's not job loss that's going to be the main impact that's felt by American workers. It's going to be the downward pressure on wages and benefits. And so even if you're a firefighter, a home care provider, you're in some profession, there's no way it can be offshored, your family is still going to be affected by this in very real ways. And finally, all this direct job loss, all this downward pressure on wages and benefits, obviously has ripple effects throughout the economy. And I say, oh, 2 minutes, really? Okay, I'm going to skip ahead. And those ripple effects, obviously, would affect the tax revenue needed for public service jobs. Moving ahead, the TPP is a 29-chapter pact, so not only will it affect jobs, wages, but it has all sorts of goodies for corporations built into it. Wall Street, for example, is very interested in the financial services chapter as a way to handcuff future financial regulations. Big Ag and the so-called life sciences companies are very interested in using the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter and other chapters to head off food safety standards, to head off food labeling standards. The IP chapter, intellectual property, to put it simply, is a gift for big pharma and would be a disaster for public health throughout the world. The leaked text shows that the U.S. is pushing to expand medicine patents beyond their current 20 years, which, if you look at a drug like HIV, a disease like HIV, a monopoly patented medicine can easily cost over $10,000 per patient per year when it's patented. When the patent comes off, it can go down to, much closer to $100 per patient per year. So the Nobel Peace Prize winning group, Doctors Without Borders, is one of the many who've pointed out that this means much higher healthcare costs in developed countries. And in developing countries, it just means longer periods of time where people cannot access life-saving generic medications. They call this the most harmful trade pact ever for access to medicines. Another major chapter that was leaked was the investment chapter. And what this shows is that the TPP would give transnational corporations the power to challenge virtually any government action that cuts into their expectation of profits. That could be a new law, a new regulation, a permitting decision, a court decision. If it cuts into their expectation of profits, what they expected to make when they made that investment, they can challenge that as an indirect expropriation and demand government compensation. The challenges are not heard through the U.S. court system or any country's domestic judicial system. They're heard by a private tribunal of trade attorneys, often corporate trade attorneys who represent Fortune 500 companies as their day jobs. And these tribunals, they can't literally force a country to change its policies, but they can award a judgment against a country that's worth millions and in some instances even billions of dollars. So if the country doesn't want additional challenges brought against it, it gets in line. And I'll give you just 2 examples of this because I know I'm running late on time. When the people of Ecuador finally won a multi-billion-dollar court judgment against Chevron to aid in the cleanup of the Amazon, the company turned to an investor state tribunal and had that judgment stayed. in the hopes, obviously, of getting a future judgment that they don't have to pay it at all. In June of last year, the French firm Veolia even initiated a claim against the Egyptian government, arguing that increases to the Egyptian minimum wage are something that it needs to be compensated for. Okay, so anyone who's worked to get a law passed or to get a major infrastructure project approved, or saw a court case through to judgment, just imagine doing all that work and then having a corporation go to a private tribunal and getting it overturned. That's what the TPP would do. We do have a couple, we have a number of agreements that already have this process in place, but for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, they've been with small developing countries. And so it's mainly been big corporations from big countries smashing the sovereignty of small countries, which would obviously continue under the TPP, but with big capital exporting nations like Japan involved, the chickens could come home to roost. We could see our own policies smashed as well. So that was sort of the quick version. Let me just really take one more minute to mention our paths to victory here. Because I said at the start, we do have a successful track record of defeating corporate power grabs like this. We know how to do it. And I'll suggest, we really need to pursue a simple two-part strategy. First, we need to drag this agreement out of the shadows. We need to shine a spotlight on it. We need to make sure our members know about it, know about the impacts it could have on their lives, and that they're contacting their members of Congress. That will introduce a level of accountability to the negotiations. It'll make it a lot harder for them to cut the most heinous deals. Secondly, and most importantly, for those of us in the United States, we need to stop fast track. Fast track is a Nixon-era policymaking procedure that allows trade agreements to circumvent ordinary congressional review, amendment, and debate procedures. Simple trade agreements can pass Congress without fast track. Hundreds have, but these major corporate power grabs cannot pass without special consideration where they're rushed through. Fast track expired in 2007. It would need to be reapplied to apply to the TPP. The battle over fast track is in the House of Representatives. The vast majority of House Democrats are going to vote with us on this. A smaller number of House Republicans are going to vote with us. Some on principle, a few more because they've got maybe textiles in their district and have commercial concerns, and then an unknown number, because they hate the president and they don't want to give him a win. We want to rely on as few Republican votes as possible, and that means getting as many Democratic votes as possible, each and every one we can get. And Kian is going to speak later on those members in New York who are still on the fence and who need your work. So let me just close by saying, number one, we've defeated fast track before, but the last time it was voted on, we lost by 2 votes. So let's do the work and save our members and working people throughout the world a world of hurt by getting Democrats to act like Democrats and side with constituents on this issue. And to stay updated, visit our website, follow us on Twitter and all that. Thank you.
First of all, I invite you to copy down my email address, phone number, Twitter account, all of that. Follow me on Twitter. I'm tweeting about TPP and a lot of other important trade issues. The AFL-CIO has released the Executive Council statement earlier this year, which was very critical of the TPP, which Arthur referred to. We also had a resolution on it at our convention, which was just last month in Los Angeles. But the Federation has not taken an official position for or against the TPP at this point. All of the affiliates are not in line, so what we've been doing is working to educate people about it, educate people about the dangers, the prospects, because you can't have any kind of movement or public opinion about something if people don't even know what it is. So it's really important to figure out what this is, how it fits in with the rest of our economic policy, and decide for yourself what you want to do to avoid the worst possible outcomes. So this is the audience participation portion. What do you guys think is wrong with U.S. trade policy? Everything. Give an example.
take all the jobs and throw them away.
Okay, so it sends jobs overseas. What else? Yes?
It's short-sighted.
Okay, say why it's short-sighted.
Well, it just, in a lot of situations, it sacrifices later for the now and for short-term economic gain.
Okay, good, yes.
Favors multinationals and restricts government's democracy to make laws.
Absolutely, yes.
Undermines environmental and other regulations.
Absolutely,
I
yes.
consulted September 12, 1993 Youth Conference, the bipartisan presidential Youth Conference, supporting NAFTA and the reason that, let's go back there. That's where it started big time.
Okay, great.
Rich.
Yes, right? Socialize the losses, privatize the gains. Yes?
Seems like the leaders have no stop to this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a goal in and of itself. So let's see if we covered all of these things. We didn't talk so much about human rights or labor rights, but I think we got all the rest of it. And it really hasn't been good for any of those things and does definitely put profits over people. And sort of Walmart is kind of the example because Walmart is oppressing workers in China with its demands for lower and lower priced products. It's oppressing its own employees here, and it really only exists because of, what we mentioned about socializing its losses. It couldn't use its business model if it weren't for food stamps and Medicaid and all of these other things. So basically what we know from NAFTA onwards is that these type of trade agreements, they don't work, with a caveat. They work for about 1%. They do create gains, but the way our economic system is modeled, those gains are being captured by a tiny little group and they're not being shared. And the goal of the AFL-CIO right now, based on our convention, is to create shared prosperity. That means fair day's pay for a fair day's work. Everybody gets the benefits of the economy. What we found are job losses from the biggest trade agreements that we've been involved with so far. Almost 700 jobs lost to Mexico due to NAFTA, and 2.7 million jobs lost to China just as a result of China joining the WTO. That's what Arthur was talking about, China PNTR. Now, when you think about the job losses, don't imagine that it's the great job with a good salary and health benefits and a pension like the workers had when they worked in factories here that are just picked up and moved to Mexico. Nope, that job is sort of destroyed, gone poof. And what's created in Mexico is a sweatshop job where the workers are repressed. And if they have a union, it's likely to be a yellow union controlled by the management where the workers don't even know what's in their supposed collective bargaining agreement. So this is just a list of jobs lost to China. And what I wanted to point out, people assume it's just manufacturing. That's really not the case. If you look at the items in red, it could cover what a lot of you folks do in the room and what your members do, because it's services as well. Of the 2.7 million jobs lost to China since it joined the WTO, 2.1 million are in manufacturing, which means 600,000 of those jobs are in services. And that's, the next big move is call centers being sent off seas, X-rays being read on computer overseas, legal services being done online, any kind of service that you can think about, that can be offshored. Even construction jobs can be offshored. I was talking to IBEW members and they were saying that the companies are now importing whole walls that are pre-wired. So you don't need any electricians. You just put the walls together and poof, you've got the room or the building. I've got a few slides that are just to give you a graphic visual of what's happening in our economy. And these are all related to all neoliberal trade policy. So these effects are not just from trade, but trade certainly plays a big part of it. It's neoliberal tax policy. It's deregulation. It's the loss of real rights under the National Labor Relations Act, all of those things. So this shows you from 1947 to 1973, the yellow bars. Look how equal the growth in United States society was. And look which quintile had the greatest income growth. The poorest. That's exactly what you want, right? If you're creating a more equal society, the income of the poor has to grow faster than the income of the rich. That's how that was the New Deal. That was the Civil Rights Act, right? That was the Equal Pay Act. All those things created that a strong National Labor Relations Board which protected workers' rights. Yeah. After 73, it started the neoliberal trend. It actually accelerated with the Reagan-Thatcher era, 1980. And then, of course, you know, stepped on the gas with the Clinton-Bush NAFTA in 92, and has continued. So that's the red chart. You can see what has changed since the 70s. Not only is the top quintile growing more, but even that really is unequal, because the top 0.1% and the top 0.1%, they're literally off the chart. We couldn't include, the chart would have been so small to include the full red line that it wouldn't have been understandable. And this is something everyone in this room knows. As union density shrinks, because unions lose bargaining power, because now we're competing with folks who make $38 a month, the middle class shrinks. Okay, this is key. I was over in Europe actually for 3 weeks. I just got back last Saturday, working on a trade agreement that we are just starting with Europe. So it'll be this exact process. We're talking about the TPP, but with Europe. So there are some different things. With Europe, we're not talking about low-cost export platform and people who make $38 a month. But it's being sold to Europeans as, this is what's going to save us from the crisis. This is what's going to raise wages. Well, Europe is having the same problem we are. Wages are totally decoupled from productivity. So no matter if a trade agreement actually increases productivity, as you know, the David Ricardo economic theory predicts, if workers can't capture any of those gains, what's the point? This is what we have to fix, is this decoupling of productivity and wages. Okay, so a new study by the Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. The AFL-CIO is going to do an event next Friday at our headquarters in Washington, D.C. on this. Just showing, so it's not just job losses, it's wage suppression. Because now we've got a global labor market where capital is looking to capture the lowest pay, the lowest rights, all of this. And what is $37 billion in wages due to our trade with China in just 1 year. So that's huge. So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. Here's a question. What's wrong with all those Democrats who say to us as labor, we're with you, we're really with you on everything, but I'm sorry I have to vote for this trade agreement? That's how they should feel, right? Put a bag over their head, because a lot's really wrong with that, actually. So this is just a map of all the countries involved. You saw this in the video. Basically, Arthur went over this. I just wanted to add that the Obama administration, in terms of trade, is doing what I think the Bush administration did really well. And this is sort of Orwellian language and stealing words. And do you guys remember healthy forests and clear skies and all of those things that were like pro-pollution and pro-cutting down trees? Well, the Obama administration stole our language. They talk about a new trade model. They talk about a 21st century trade agreement. They talk about high standards. But those don't mean the same thing when they talk about high standards. So just be careful of knowing what words mean when you hear them. Largely looks like NAFTA. They've added a few bells and whistles to make it look like the new model. But most of those new chapters that they're adding, they've told us, aren't really enforceable. So you can have a chapter on small and medium enterprises and say small and medium enterprises are going to really benefit from this deal. But unless you have somehow real rules that help small enterprises compete with Citibank and GE and Caterpillar and Walmart, it's not going to happen. It's just pretty words. A couple of very specific things. Buy America. How many people are familiar with Buy America policies? Okay. So in our trade agreements from NAFTA forward, including at the WTO, we make these commitments called government purchasing commitments. And what they do is they obligate us to treat those trading partners as American companies for the purposes of Buy America legislation, unless they take a specific exception. So what the U.S. has taken specific exceptions for are basically federal highway projects and transit projects. So you can generally be assured if a highway project or a transit project is happening with federal money, it's American iron, it's American steel. However, you can have an example of California, which turned down federal money because they didn't want to buy American. They wanted to use a Chinese contractor with Chinese steel, so they didn't use federal money. When Buy American applies to other projects where we haven't taken exceptions, so building a new courthouse, building a new federal building, they can apply Buy American to it, but American will count as any country we have a free trade agreement with or any country that has signed the procurement agreement at the WTO. So what does that mean? You're trying to create jobs in your city, in your state, in the country, because our economy is really, really bad. Well, things are going really well in Australia, and Australia can come in and bid, and they can take all that money. So President Obama was actually criticized that about a third of his big stimulus bill, the American Reinvestment Recovery Act, went overseas. Well, it went overseas because we already have these commitments. So, and again, this impacts not just construction projects or buying paper or buying equipment, but it affects services contracts. So if you have a government that's actually outsourcing rather than insourcing and providing a service with public employees, you still at least could capture those jobs for US workers, potentially, if your state has a policy of Buy New York or Buy America. But if New York signs up to the TPP, and the TPP contains these provisions, what it means is the Australian, New Zealand, Vietnamese, Malaysian, Chilean, whatever, all those companies can compete equally. So those jobs, especially if they're call center jobs, helping folks get social services, they can be gone. Are people familiar with the concept of state-owned enterprises? So this is where the government owns all or a portion of a particular business. Doesn't happen a lot in the United States unless you're talking about public services, like the New York Transit Authority. It's really, really common in most other countries and very common in Asian countries. And they compete commercially. So if you're talking about a large Chinese telecom company, a large Chinese steel company, electronics, they're often actually totally owned or partially owned by the Chinese government. So they can compete differently. The Chinese government can say you don't pay taxes. You get a loan which you don't have to pay back, or you get a loan with a 1% interest rate. Or you get your inputs to build your widget discounted or free from this other state-owned enterprise. So they can really compete unfairly and drive, private companies that have to pay the market cost of capital and the market cost of wages and the market cost of inputs out of business. And it's not that countries shouldn't have the right to be involved in their own economies. The problem for American workers comes if those state-owned enterprises come invest on American soil and set up shop down the street from a US company and purposely, compete in a predatory way to drive the competitors out of business. Because you will end up, if that happens, with one of two things. You have a monopsony, like a single buyer for labor then, just the state-owned enterprise, because they've driven everybody else out of business, or they drive the American companies out of business, and then they take their money and pack up and go home and take the jobs back to the country they came from, and then we've got a whole devastated sector. So there should be rules to cover that don't tell countries how to run their economy, but do set rules for fair competition. Public services. So a lot of people think, well, my job's safe because you can't trade it away. That's not true anymore. You certainly can trade it away. Number one, when we lose manufacturing, who's paying the property taxes for that factory anymore? Perhaps nobody. That's a loss of revenue. What happens to all those workers who either have no jobs or lesser jobs? Well, that's lost revenue for income taxes. In addition, we talked about how the government services can be outsourced and competed overseas. So there are lots of ways. If you're cutting government revenue, government's going to say, oh, austerity, let's cut public service workers, let's do furloughs, let's get rid of the pensions. All these things that are already happening can happen more. And so government investment, we're going to see more of what we've seen, which is just fewer projects, because there's this real push for the sequester, the austerity. Until we get more money flowing to our government, we're going to have less investment, and that's bad for construction folks. And let's see. So jobs and wages, basically, you guys know this stuff. Wages go down, you lose jobs. There's all kinds of ways that this can happen. I'm just going to try and wrap up here. Japan in particular. So Japan, in theory, this is the kind of country we want to trade with. High wages, about double the union density that we have. You'd think this would be a good thing. The problem is it's hard to get U.S. exports into the Japanese market, and we've had a problem trading with them all the way back. Anyone that was around in the 80s remembers Reagan was actually pretty good on trade issues with Japan and got them to agree to voluntary export restraints. Said, we're going to slap tariffs on your vehicles unless you stop sending so many to the U.S., and it was helpful to the U.S. car companies. Problem is, there was no WTO then. You can't do that now. You can't threaten Japan with higher tariffs. So if they're in the deal and we just zero out all tariffs, we're going to have even more Japanese exports to the U.S., which is fine. But again, if we can't get equivalent exports to Japan, that's a problem for U.S. jobs. Okay, so I was at one of these negotiating rounds that I've talked about, and I stood up and I was trying to ask them an easy question. Again, remembering the AFL-CIO hasn't taken a position. We're looking for what's going to be good in the agreement for workers. So I said, okay, I know you guys are doing a labor chapter, but what else? Nothing. There were all the chief negotiators on the panel, and they sort of were silent, and then they giggled, and then they were silent, and then they giggled some more. It was really kind of creepy. And finally, the Malaysian negotiator said, well, we are working hard to protect our indigenous population. And then they moved to the next question. So anyway, so these are the sticky negotiating issues. They haven't completed them yet. Obviously, the state-owned enterprises, but the environmental chapter, the intellectual property issues Arthur touched on. And it's not just with medicines. Think about this. If anybody saw the New York Times article, I think it was 2 Sundays ago, how the U.S. system basically allows patents to stay patents forever. Nothing comes off patent because what the companies do is make a different kind of inhaler for your asthma medicine or change it from a liquid gel to a cap, and they get a brand new patent. And they want to put these rules on other countries. Okay, you know what's at stake if we get this wrong. 2 more things. I already talked about the European agreement. There's also an agreement called the TISA, the Trade and International Services Agreement for public service folks. This is potentially a threat if it doesn't protect public services. The Europeans are kind of going crazy about this, and we need to be more involved here. We know what's next. Brothers and sisters have to work together. And then here's just a bunch of things. There's a Delora letter on fast track that Arthur was talking about. You can write your legislators and ask to see the text. So there's lots of ways to be involved. We've got a petition. If you watch that video that you saw at the very end of it, there's a petition. If you go to the site aflcio.org/fair-TPP, there's a petition, and it basically goes to the lead trade minister from every country, all 12 countries, and it says, we don't want a trade agreement that doesn't protect workers, create jobs, make medicines affordable, protect the environment, and get rid of this investor-state process. So it's aflcio.org, so that's just a general site, and then /fair- or hyphen, so the short one, TPP. So fair-TPP. And I think that's basically it. I just want to go back briefly to the title. So the title I put, the TPP, NAFTA 2, bigger and badder, question mark. Like what we wanted, if anybody remembers when Obama was running for president, he said, let's renegotiate NAFTA. So in a way, he's like fulfilling his campaign promise, right? Because this is NAFTA +9. But the question is, we wanted better. Are we going to get better or are we going to get badder? I don't want to view like this as the Terminator was bad, the Terminator 2 was meaner, Godzilla was bad, Godzilla 2 was meaner. So it's really up to us to like take control and figure out what's happened and what's our fate as workers. Thanks for listening.
My name's Kian Frederick. I'm the New York State Director for the Citizens Trade Campaign. And my job, I guess, is to give you the good news after all this bad news. And that is that there is something we can do to stop this right now. And that is stopping fast track. And Arthur discussed it briefly. Fast track is the Achilles heel of this whole thing. It's the sneaky way that they want to slide this through. Fast track is a procedural move in Congress where Congress literally gives up its constitutional authority to regulate trade with foreign nations. Article 1, Section 8. And they give it up to the executive branch. And as Arthur mentioned, this it was invented by Nixon in the 1970s. So we had a good system that worked for 200 years, and then Nixon, Tricky Dick, came up with this system. And since he came up with it, about 200 trade deals have been negotiated the good old-fashioned way, and only 16 have been needed to be fast-tracked, and those are all the bad ones. So fast-track is for bad trade agreements that they don't want anybody to see. And what happens, for example, with the TPP, is it gets negotiated, it's a done deal, and Congress has already voted to give up its authority. The TPP comes to Congress, they get to vote yes or no, up or down, and they can't change anything, they can't amend anything, there's no committee process, none of that stuff. So it keeps the secrecy. And the U.S. Trade Representative has already said that he wants to keep the text of the TPP secret for 4 years until after it's approved. So, yeah, hello, I know, if you're looking at me like, where's your tinfoil hat? This is America. Yeah, well, that's what they want to do if we let them get away with it. But the good news is that New York State rocks, let me just tell you. So in the past couple of months, as I said, I'm new here. So when I first started in this position, we only had 2 people who had signed on to something called the DeLauro letter. Rosa DeLauro is a representative Congress from Connecticut. Many of you know her, very good friend to labor, very good friend to environmental activists and all that. And she has sponsored a letter to the president which simply says, there's a lot of secrecy here, and we're the Congress people that are supposed to be in charge of this trade deal thing, and you're not telling us anything. So you know what, Mr. President? We're going to vote against fast track, and we're going to do it the slow track, old-fashioned way, like the old fogies who wrote the Constitution said we should. So we're picking the founders of the Constitution over Tricky Dick's system, sir. And so when I started, we had 2 representatives who had signed on. And I'm happy to say we currently have 15 signed on, plus there's a letter that the Republicans are doing, and we have 2 of our 6 Republicans signed on. So we are very proud to say that we have a bipartisan majority of our New York State congressional delegation opposed and publicly committed to voting no on fast track. So that's a very good thing. And very briefly, the way we did it was thinking strategically about the power that we had. We know that we're up against a lot of, obviously, corporate power, but also political power because we're talking about Democrats, and their Democratic president is going to be calling them. So we really exploited, in a very good way, the raw power of constituency. And you see the results in just a couple of months, right? Weeks, really. And so many people came together, yes, labor, but community groups, all that. I want to point to Susan Metz, who from Clark's district, from the Park Slope Food Co-op, God bless. And yes, and she led her delegation of constituents. And they met, she opened her house, and we did this across the city. And throughout the state, folks met, they educated themselves, they understood the process, they understood their role. We're going to sit there, we're going to look our rep in the eye, and we're going to say, what are you going to do about this? And it worked. So we're continuing to organize. Susan, you have an event coming up on the 13th of December, I'm sorry. Yep, there we go. So
Food Co-op voted 16,000.
That's right.
Members. We sent letters to all New York City Congress members saying vote no on fast track. And we will have monthly open meetings, popular education and organizing to expose the TPP and to discuss strategy. The first one is
the 13th of December, 13th. Yeah.
And the second is Friday, January 10th. They're open to non-members. It's in central Brooklyn. Please come. I have flyers.
So what we're doing now that we've pretty much got everybody is we're moving into the organized rapid response stage, because the fast track vote is coming up in the next couple of weeks, couple of months. The administration the U.S. Trade Representative just said, we want fast track as soon as possible. And let's be clear, the fast track vote is going to happen before the vote on the TPP. So we like to say, educate yourself on the TPP, focus on fast track, because that's the only way. If we deny and fast track, we win the fast track vote, that we drag this thing out into the open and it goes through the regular committee process, and it will not survive that. That's the only way to stop it. So we're continuing to organize where folks have signed on. The job for you guys, and I'm going to pass this around and ask you to sign up if you'd like to receive more information and about what's happening here in New York, in the city. We have a couple of holdouts. You'll be surprised perhaps to learn there's 6 of them left. Our top targets are Charlie Rangel, who has said, I will vote against fast track. I believe in slow track. Well, good. We need you to sign on to the Deloro letter, sir. Also Congresswoman Lowy, Congressman Engel, if you live in Co-op City, give him a call. And upstate Congressman Owens are the people that are left out. And Congressman Crowley, who we don't think is going to sign. He's kind of a free trader, but call him. And sadly, Congressman Meeks is not only pro-fast track, supportive of the TPP, he is one of the leaders of the TPP caucus in the House. So his job is to go around and kind of schmooze these folks, even the ones that have signed on to the Deloro letter. We're continuing to organize because we know that, hey, they can change their vote. I didn't know if you knew that, right? At the last minute. So we're going to keep the pressure on. So those are the folks that we need some help with. And then specifically, if you really want to get out there, on Monday, at 68th and Park from 10:30 to noon, we're having just a little leafleting action. We're having a visitor, a Representative Schwartz, who's on the Ways and Means Committee, very important person to have signed the Deloro letter, who has refused so far. And she's coming to a fundraiser in New York City, as they always do. And she thinks she can hide from her constituents in Pennsylvania, but we're going to be there for our brothers and sisters. We invite you to join us, 68th and Park, 10:30 to noon next Monday. And if you sign up there, I will shoot you a little email. We don't share any of that. That's just, and I don't drive people crazy with emails because I'm too busy to do it. But I'll send you that information. Plus, I'll send you a nice one-pager for this. That's easy to talk about. Yes, sir.
This is the one who's running for governor?
Yeah, she is, right? I think she's running for governor. Yeah.
Can you quickly say something about the largest single caucus in Congress, separate of the two parties, are the progressives, and yet they never get any traction. The unity is the problem.
Well, I'm not a political analyst, and I would probably want to defer to you and others in the group, but I will say that certainly for New York State, right, and really for progressives, beating back fast track is not only the key to beating and winning the TPP and the other trade agreements that are coming down the pike that were spoken about, but it's a real punch in the nose to these corporate folks that think that they can steamroll and just keep bringing these crazy things, and it's a real builder for the progressive caucus. So thank you very much.
We don't believe that these issues are often as simple as black or white or yes or no. And that's one of the reasons we haven't come out officially supporting or opposing the TPP altogether yet, because we're still working on trying to get the USTR and the administration and members of Congress to push hard to change it so that it's not the same NAFTA model, so that it's going to be different. The minute that we come out with the position against it, the auto workers are not going to be asked to be in the room to talk about auto issues. The steel workers are not going to be asked to be in the room to talk about rules of origin and state-owned enterprises. So it's really important to there's a lot of things. This could happen. It doesn't get stopped. It's really awful. And we lose a lot of jobs and it destroys the economy forever. This could happen, and it's not that awful, and there are some things, some accomplishments we can get in it, or it can be totally stopped. We think that the latter two are much better than the first one, and not working on the content at all is a problem and is counterproductive. Same with fast track. We're actually working with Senator Sherrod Brown, who's probably the single best advocate of fair trade policies, manufacturing. I could just talk like this. You know, for workers in the entire United States Congress, on writing an alternative bill and saying this is the process and it's going to be more open and it's going to be more democratic, and Congress will have an opportunity when the bill is brought back, if it doesn't achieve the goals, to say it does deserve fast track benefits or it doesn't deserve fast track benefits. And we don't think that it's really productive to tell everybody now, vote no, when you don't know what the bill is going to look like. So, pardon me? Well, if a fast track bill is introduced and it's the bad fast track, we will tell people to vote no on it. But as I said, we're working on what's the content of the bill, so we're not going to tell people how to vote yet because we haven't seen it. So with regard to your question about food safety, I'm not aware of the Codex being involved at all. The problem with the food safety chapter, the SPS, is that what it does is it basically tells countries these are the kinds of food safety regulations you can or cannot have, and it locks those in forever. So if the rules say you can't have, for instance, labeling on genetically modified foods, or you can't have labeling on country of origin, or you can't do...
That you have to use antibiotics.
Well, it wouldn't mandate that you have to, but it would say you couldn't... It would... Yeah, that I don't think is realistic, but these are the kinds of rumors that you get when the text is secret, because nobody really knows. What it could do is say you can't ban the use of antibiotics, and that kind rather than saying that you must use it. But these are legitimate questions that you need to ask your elected officials about what's going on in that chapter. And then finally, with regard to the austerity question, the ILO and the TUAC, the Trade Union Advisory Council to the OECD, they've done a lot of studies, and they know that austerity doesn't work. And still, the IMF is pushing it, just the way they pushed restructuring on developing countries in the 80s and the 90s. And they know that it doesn't work. But again, these institutions, the European Central Bank, the IMF, they're run by the 1%. And what's happening in Europe in particular is that the big industrial countries, Germany and the Nordics, are doing a pretty good job of keeping their workers safe from the negative effects of austerity, so that they're not seeing the response against it in their countries while they impose austerity on the European South and the European East and places like Ireland.